The air smelled of earth, smoke, and oak. In the heart of a medieval village, a dozen people gathered around a patch of cleared ground. To modern eyes, it was just mud, uneven, damp, ordinary. But to them, it was sacred. Before a single timber was lifted, before any hammer struck a nail, the ground had to be spoken to. The act of building a home wasn't merely construction. It was a ritual, a conversation between man, nature, and the unseen forces that ruled them both. In the Middle Ages, every home began as a prayer. People didn't believe you could simply take a piece of land and build upon it. You had to ask permission. The earth was alive, filled with spirits, both good and ill, and disturbing it without respect could bring misfortune, illness, or even death. When a new cottage was to be built, the villagers treated it like the birth of a living creature. It wasn't just the creation of walls and a roof. It was the awakening of a spirit that would share their lives, watch over their children, and one day outlive them. A man might own the land by the Lord's decree, but it was the earth that decided whether he would prosper there. So before digging, the head of the household would walk the site at dawn, whispering blessings and promises to the soil. Sometimes he would place a handful of bread or a silver coin in the ground as an offering. If birds came and ate the bread, it was a good omen. The spirits of the field were pleased. But if the gift remained untouched, it meant the ground was stubborn, perhaps haunted, and another location would have to be chosen. To us, this might sound like superstition, but to them, it was logic shaped by experience. Storms, rot, sickness, these things came without warning, and faith was their only protection. To ignore the old ways was to tempt disaster. They had seen it before. Walls that collapsed for no reason, roofs that caught fire on windless nights, families struck by misfortune soon after moving in. So they built with prayer as much as with tools. When the first sod was turned, silence would fall. The oldest man in the group might murmur a psalm or a charm to keep away spirits of the deep. Then came the driving of the first stake, the heart post, the symbolic spine of the future house. It was done in a single blow if possible, for luck, and the hammer used for that strike would never again be used for a grave. Every motion carried meaning, every gesture a trace of the sacred. What we might call construction, they called creation. The builders believed a house was born the same way a human was, from earth, breath, and spirit. Each cottage had its own soul, formed at the moment of its raising, and to harm a house was to harm that spirit. People even spoke to their homes, thanking them after storms, apologizing when walls were patched, blessing them when a new child was born within. In that world, where nature's will was law, every plank, every stone, every handful of straw carried intention. Building wasn't just a matter of shelter. It was an act of faith, a pact between man and creation. The cottage was not owned, it was honored. And as the morning mist lifted over the quiet fields, the villagers would begin their work, slowly, reverently, with laughter, prayer, and superstition binding them together. Because in the medieval world, a house was not built by hands alone. It was built by belief. Before a single log was lifted, or a wall imagined, the first step in building a medieval cottage was to listen to the land itself. Choosing where to build was not a matter of convenience or proximity. It was a matter of survival, guided by superstition as much as by wisdom. The wrong ground could curse a family for generations. The right one could bless them with health and prosperity. In the medieval mind, the earth was not passive. It was alive, moody, and full of unseen power. A builder did not simply look for a flat space to place his home. He looked for signs. The flight of birds, the way water pooled after rain, the color of the grass, all of these were messages. If a plot teemed with worms and beetles, It meant the soil was fertile and safe. But if the ground was bare, lifeless, or if livestock avoided it, people believed something sinister slept beneath. Perhaps it was the resting place of a forgotten grave, or a spot cursed by an old misdeed. Medieval villagers didn't risk it. They would rather build on the edge of a marsh than on a place the earth itself seemed to reject. Some traditions called for testing the ground. A man might bury a loaf of bread wrapped in linen overnight. If it remained fresh by morning, the ground was pure. If mold crept over it or animals dug it up, it meant the land was restless, unfit for dwelling. Others poured milk or honey into the soil as offerings, food for the spirits who dwelled below. To them, this wasn't foolishness, but negotiation. The home would share its breath with the earth, and peace had to be made before that union began. There were even omens tied to time and weather. To mark the building's boundaries on a windy day was bad luck. The spirits of the air might scatter the home's fortune. Beginning the work on a Friday was to invite sorrow, but a Monday dawn was favored, the day of the moon, symbol of new beginnings. Builders listened to the sounds of the night before choosing a site. If owls called nearby or foxes barked too often, it was a warning that hidden forces lingered there. But not every ritual was born from superstition. Beneath the beliefs lay a remarkable practicality. Builders avoided low, damp ground not because of spirits, but because of rot. They avoided certain soils not out of fear, but from generations of experience watching floods and sickness strike the unwise. The spiritual and the sensible walked hand in hand. Once the site was chosen, it was claimed. The head of the family would drive a small wooden stake into the center of the chosen spot, the heart of the future hearth. Around it, he or she might walk 3 times clockwise, murmuring a blessing or reciting a psalm. Some even carried a branch of rowan or holly to ward off misfortune as they circled. It was said that if you stood in the middle of your chosen land at sunrise and felt warmth before shadow, the ground had accepted you, and so, before stone or wood touched the site, the invisible work was done, the sealing of a silent pact. The chosen ground had been tested, spoken to, and blessed. The villagers believed that if this step was neglected, no wall, no matter how strong, would ever stand for long. In the soft light of morning, when the mist lifted and the first bird stirred, one could almost feel it, the hum beneath the soil, as if the land itself was aware that something new was about to be born upon its back. The people didn't just build on the earth, they built with it, because in their eyes, every home began not with timber, but with trust. Once the ground had been chosen and blessed, the villagers prepared to define the home's shape, its body, its breadth, and its boundaries. In the medieval world, this was not simply a task of measurement or layout. Marking the footprint of a cottage was a sacred act. It was believed that the moment the first stakes entered the ground, the house began to wake. Its soul, fragile and new, was forming. Every line traced upon the soil would become the skeleton of a living being, a space meant to shelter laughter, birth, prayer, and eventually, death. At dawn, before the day's work began, the master builder would gather the family and neighbors. They stood in silence as he took a wooden stake, carved smooth and tipped with ash. With a firm hand, he drove it into the earth at the center of the chosen plot, the spot where the hearth would one day burn. This was called the heart post. Around it, the outline of the home was set, 4 corners for 4 directions, each one bound by both meaning and prayer. To the medieval mind, the number 4 was sacred. Earth, air, fire, and water, birth, labor, death, and faith. Each corner represented one of these forces, and to ignore any of them was to invite imbalance. When the builders placed the stakes, they whispered small invocations under their breath, blending pagan and Christian blessings in one breath. "May this corner stand strong as the mountain," they might say at the northern post. "May this one burn bright with hearth fire," at the southern. Every direction carried its own prayer, its own hope for balance. But faith wasn't the only ritual at work. Objects were often buried beneath the corners, a silent offering to bind the home to good fortune, a coin for prosperity, a small bone or feather for protection. Sometimes even a raw egg, carefully placed beneath the foundation stone to absorb misfortune before it reached the living. There are records from across Europe of builders finding strange objects when repairing medieval homes centuries later. Broken shoes, herbs wrapped in cloth, or animal skulls neatly sealed under thresholds. These weren't random. They were spiritual armor. The moment the boundaries were marked, the site became alive. Outsiders treated it with respect. No one crossed the lines without permission. Children were told not to play there. Their laughter might disturb the spirits watching over the build. Animals, too, were kept away, for fear they might sense something unseen and bring bad omens. In some villages, the master builder or priest would walk the perimeter carrying a branch of hawthorn dipped in blessed water, sprinkling each corner while reciting psalms or old charms. In older, rural regions, where pre-Christian traditions still held sway, the builders might instead burn incense or drop a few grains of salt and barley at each boundary post, food for the spirits, a gesture of respect to the ancient guardians of the land. Then came the first hammer strike, the sound that woke the site. When the first stake met the mallet, all work paused for a heartbeat. The builder would lift his head, waiting. If the sound rang sharp and clear, it was a good omen. The ground was solid and willing. If the blow echoed hollow or dull, the men would exchange worried looks. Some said that meant the earth below was restless, or worse, that the spirits were displeased. On such a day, the work might stop entirely until the next morning to give the land time to settle. But when all four corners stood firm in the ground and the lines of the cottage took shape, something remarkable happened. The villagers could finally see it. Not yet a house, but the promise of one. The outlines traced in earth spoke of warmth, family, and permanence. The people who stood there didn't just see walls, they saw generations. And as the morning sun climbed higher and light spread across the staked ground, the builder would raise his hand and declare softly, "The home has begun." From that moment forward, the space was no longer just dirt and air. It was sacred territory, the cradle of a living spirit that would soon be bound in timber and stone. When the first beams rose, the air seemed to change. The scent of raw timber and churned soil mixed with the murmurs of prayer and the rhythmic thud of hammers. To the medieval villager, this was not just construction. This was creation. The cottage was being born, and its bones were rising to meet the sky. The wooden frame, or skeleton, was the heart of every medieval cottage. Built from oak, ash, or chestnut, each beam was cut and fitted by hand, guided by instinct more than measurement. But before the first timber was lifted, each piece was blessed. Builders would often mark crosses, runes, or initials onto the beams, not for ownership, but for protection. These carvings were small spells of safety, to keep fire and lightning away, and to guard the household from ill luck. When the first post was raised, the builder would drive a small coin or charm beneath it, a foundation offering. It could be a silver penny, a tuft of wool, or even a sprig of rosemary. It wasn't payment for labor. It was payment for peace. The act symbolized giving back to the earth what one had taken, sealing the bond between land and dwelling. The raising of the frame was a communal act, a festival of labor. Neighbors gathered, pulling ropes, lifting beams, chanting blessings between grunts of effort. As the timbers locked into place, a strange silence often fell, not from exhaustion, but awe. The outline of a home had become real, casting its first shadow on the earth. When the roof beam, the ridgepole, was finally lifted, a small ritual known across Europe took place: the topping out. A branch, usually from a local tree like birch or oak, was fastened to the highest beam. To modern eyes, it might seem decorative, but to them, it was sacred. The tree was a living symbol, linking the new home to the world that gave it life. It honored the forest that had provided the wood and offered thanks to the spirits that dwelled within it. Some villages used flowers or ribbons, others sprinkled ale or milk upon the beam as a toast to luck and fertility. The builders celebrated that night. The family would host a small feast, sharing bread, cheese, and beer with everyone who had helped. Children danced beneath the unfinished walls, women sang old songs about hearth and harvest, and men told stories of past builds, of houses that stood for generations and those that fell before their time. It was a night of gratitude, laughter, and unspoken reverence, yet even in joy, superstition remained. No one would sleep inside the frame that first night, not even the owners. The house was said to be too young, its spirit unsettled. To rest inside before its soul had settled was to invite dreams of wandering ghosts. Instead, they would place a lit candle in the center of the floor and leave it to burn until morning. The flickering flame was thought to guide the new house spirit, showing it where to rest and where to keep watch. As dawn arrived, the candle's smoke curled upward through the open rafters, a final offering to the sky. The people believed that if the smoke rose straight and steady, the house would know peace. But if it wavered or drifted toward the door, it was a warning. The home would face trials, and its owners must remain vigilant. By the end of that day, the cottage had a shape, a presence, a frame humming with quiet energy. The villagers would pass by and nod respectfully, whispering, "It stands well." They knew that a house wasn't built in a single day, nor by human hands alone. Something older, quieter, and far more mysterious had a hand in it, too. When the frame was raised and the roof crowned with its sacred branch, the next and most solemn task awaited: the creation of the hearth. To the medieval mind, this was not merely a place to cook or to warm the body. It was the heart of the home, the soul's anchor. A cottage could stand without walls for a time, or lack a door, but without its hearth, it was not yet alive. The hearth was always built near the center of the house, the place where all paths crossed. Its stones were chosen carefully, never taken from graveyards, never from ruins, and never from land that felt unsettled. Often, the builder or the mistress of the house would select stones from the river or field by hand, whispering blessings over each one before setting them in place. If a smooth, round stone could be found, one shaped by water, it was placed at the base as a symbol of harmony and eternal movement. Before the first fire was lit, the hearth had to be blessed. In some villages, a priest came to sprinkle holy water upon it, tracing the sign of the cross over the ashes that were not yet there. In others, where older traditions lingered, the women of the household performed their own rites. They scattered salt to drive away evil, or burned dried herbs like rosemary, mugwort, or juniper to cleanse the air. A few drops of ale might be poured into the center as an offering, not wasted but gifted to the spirits of warmth and home. Then came the moment of animation, the first flame. It was never struck from flint. That would have been too harsh, too violent for a newborn house. Instead, it was borrowed, carried carefully from the fire of a neighbor or family member. This act was deeply symbolic. The new home's life began not in isolation, but as part of the community. Its first light came from another's hearth, binding the families together in quiet fellowship. When that borrowed flame touched the fresh kindling, the family gathered around, heads bowed. For 3 days, the fire was never allowed to die. It was watched, fed, and spoken to, as though it were a child. Women placed small bits of bread near the embers, murmuring wishes for good harvests and easy winters. Men placed their hands over the flame, saying nothing but feeling the pulse of it, the warmth that meant safety, the glow that promised endurance. The hearth soon became the center of everything. Meals were cooked there, stories told there, and disputes settled in its glow. It was where infants were rocked and elders laid to rest. When someone died, a candle was taken from that same flame and placed near the body, a symbol that the house itself was mourning. Even centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered medieval cottages long lost to time, they found the hearthstones still blackened, still holding traces of soot and bone ash, the fossilized breath of family and fire. To the people who built those homes, the hearth wasn't furniture. It was faith, warmth, and protection bound into one. It kept the darkness of the wild at bay. It was where prayer met flame, and where every life in the house began and ended. When the first fire took hold and the smoke rose through the thatch, the villagers would say softly, "The house breathes now." And from that moment, it truly lived. Once the hearth was lit and the cottage had taken its first breath, a new ritual began, one older than memory and deeper than faith. The builders and neighbors returned, not with tools this time, but with food, drink, and song. The house was no longer just a frame and a roof. It was a living thing, and like any newborn, it needed to be welcomed into the world. This celebration was called by many names, house feast, roof ale, or home wake, but everywhere it meant the same thing: to honor the spirit of the new dwelling, to bind the family to it, and to ensure that no misfortune would cross its threshold. A table was set in the center of the room, often nothing more than a plank of wood balanced on barrels, and upon it were placed bread, cheese, ale, and salt. Salt was crucial. It symbolized purity, preservation, and protection. In some villages, a small pinch was cast into the fire before the meal began, a gesture of thanks to the unseen spirits said to inhabit the home. Neighbors brought gifts: a jug of ale, a loaf of bread, a bundle of herbs to hang from the rafters. Each offering carried meaning, not wealth, but goodwill. A broom made of birch branches to sweep away misfortune. A piece of coal from a blessed fire to keep the hearth warm through the first winter. A small charm, carved or woven, to hang above the door and keep out the evil eye. Before anyone ate, the eldest among them, perhaps a parent or the village elder, would walk slowly through the house, carrying a lit candle. They would touch its flame to every corner, murmuring blessings. "May this corner hold laughter," they might say. "May this one hold peace." The candle's light chased away shadows, but also symbolized knowledge and grace, a promise that ignorance, cruelty, or deceit would never take root here. Then came the feasting. Laughter filled the unfinished walls, echoing against the timber beams. Children played near the hearth, while elders told tales of old cottages that had stood through storms and wars. But underneath the cheer ran something solemn, a sense of unity, of shared survival. For in those times, a single home could mean the difference between endurance and despair. To help build or bless another's dwelling was to secure your own future in turn. Yet even in joy, the rituals of protection continued. When the guests left, a curious rite often followed. The head of the household would take a coal from the dying fire and draw a rough mark upon the lintel, a cross, a spiral, or a rune, depending on the region. Some whispered the words of Psalm 91 as they worked. "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night." Others, less bound by church, muttered older charms invoking the spirits of the land. The goal was the same, to guard the doorway, that thin line between the safety of home and the chaos beyond. A few households went further still. Under the threshold stone, they would bury a small token, sometimes a silver coin, sometimes a vial of wine, sometimes something far stranger, a scrap of parchment with a prayer written on it, or the hair of a family member. These objects, known as foundation charms, were never meant to be seen again. They were part of the invisible skeleton of the house, meant to keep it standing not just in body, but in spirit. When the fire burned low and the guests were gone, the family remained awake a little longer. They sat in silence, listening to the creaks and sighs of the new walls, the whisper of wind through thatch, the low hum of embers. These sounds, they said, were the house finding its voice. If the noises were gentle, like breathing, it was a good omen. But if the sounds were harsh or sharp, it meant the spirit of the home was restless and needed more blessing. By dawn, the cottage had been well fed, with laughter, with prayer, with the warmth of many hearts. It had been baptized not in water, but in flame, food, and song. And when the sun rose over its new roof, every villager who passed by would tip their head slightly, as if greeting not just the family within, but the house itself. Because to the people of the Middle Ages, a home wasn't just something you lived in. It was something you lived with. After the final song faded and the last ember dimmed, the cottage began its quiet life. But to the people of the Middle Ages, this was not the end of the building's story. It was the beginning of its soul's journey. Every home, they believed, had a spirit, a silent guardian that lived within its walls. Some called it the house white or brownie, others simply the hearth spirit. It was said to protect the family if honored properly, but bring ruin if forgotten. Long after the builders had gone, these invisible presences remained. Villagers would leave small offerings near the hearth, a crust of bread, a drop of milk, sometimes even a spoon of stew, for the unseen guest who kept watch at night. The spirit was thought to guard against thieves, fires, and sickness, and in return, it asked only to be remembered. If the family neglected it or mocked the old traditions, strange things might happen. Milk turning sour, tools vanishing, or eerie knocking sounds in the rafters. These tales weren't just superstition. They were ways to explain the unpredictable, the creaks of settling wood, the wind sighing through gaps in the thatch, or the small accidents of daily life. But to those who lived in these homes, such signs carried meaning. When they heard the boards groan or the chimney whistle, they would murmur, "The house speaks," and leave a small token of thanks on the mantel. New families moving into old cottages often continued the same rituals. Before unpacking their belongings, they would kneel by the hearth and greet the spirit aloud. "Be kind to us, as we will be to you." It was not an empty phrase. It was an invitation to coexist, to form a bond between living and unseen. In this way, the spirit of the home was never just one being. It was a continuation of everyone who had ever lived there. Even the smallest cottages were alive with these quiet presences. The walls carried memories, laughter, sorrow, the echoes of 1,000 simple lives. When a child was born, a small sprig of rosemary was burned in the fire, its smoke rising as an offering to the home's spirit, ensuring the child would be loved and protected. And when someone died, a candle burned by the hearth for 3 days, guiding the soul safely out, while ensuring no lost shadow lingered behind. Over time, these beliefs became woven into the daily rhythm of life. Before leaving for work in the fields, a peasant might whisper, "Watch the fire," addressing the home as if it were a trusted friend. When storms raged or wolves howled in the distance, the family gathered close to the hearth, trusting that their invisible guardian stood between them and the chaos beyond the walls. The church often frowned upon these traditions, calling them pagan or foolish. But even priests turned a blind eye when they saw a crust of bread on the hearth or herbs hanging above the door. They understood that these customs were not rebellion. They were comfort. In a world where disease, hunger, and war could strike without warning, people needed to believe that someone, or something, watched over them. And maybe, in a way, something did. The very act of care, the love poured into a home, gave it presence. The warmth of generations, the prayers whispered into smoke and wood, all of it accumulated like invisible breath. The spirits were real, not because they existed beyond the veil, but because people believed in them deeply enough to make them real. When the fire burned low at night and the house settled into silence, one might still imagine a faint shape beside the hearth. Not a ghost, but memory itself, keeping watch. Because in the medieval world, no house ever truly stood empty. It always had a spirit, and that spirit was home. As centuries passed, the cottages of that age began to sink back into the earth. The thatch rotted, the beams bowed, and the hearths cracked, their ashes long gone cold. Yet even in ruin, they seemed alive, as though the memory of all that had been built within their walls refused to fade. In fields and forests across Europe, people still stumble upon the low stone outlines of medieval homes, half swallowed by moss and time. And though the world has changed beyond recognition, the beliefs that shaped those walls still whisper through the soil. In those days, a home was not seen as property. It was a companion. Every beam and stone carried intention. To cut a tree for timber required apology to the forest. To take clay for walls required thanks to the riverbank. The peasants of medieval Europe lived in a constant dialogue with the world around them, one that modern people have largely forgotten. Their cottages were made not just of wood and wattle, but of promises. Promises to live humbly, to respect the balance between shelter and nature, to remember that every dwelling stood upon something older and more powerful than themselves. The spirits they invoked, the charms they buried, the prayers they whispered, all were acts of reverence. They believed that for a house to stand strong, it must belong to both the living and the unseen. Even the smallest detail carried meaning. A broom leaning in the corner to sweep away sorrow, a dried wreath above the door to repel envy, a cat sleeping near the hearth to guard against dark omens. To them, these weren't symbols. They were contracts, ancient agreements renewed with every dawn. And while their rituals may seem strange now, they reveal a truth that feels more vital than ever. Those who build with belief build to last. The peasants had no architects, no engineers, and often no written plans. Yet their homes endured centuries because they were built not for perfection, but for belonging. They understood that a house wasn't separate from the earth beneath it, or the people inside it. It was the bridge between them. Even as the world changed, as feudal lords fell, churches rose, and empires burned, the ritual of home building continued in quiet persistence. Villagers in the 15th century still placed coins under thresholds, just as their ancestors had. Mothers still whispered charms over newborns at the hearth. And when travelers passed by a cottage with smoke curling from its chimney, they still tipped their heads slightly, not in greeting to the people within, but to the house itself, a being alive in its own right. Today, Archaeologists uncover these cottages and marvel at their simplicity. Walls of wattle and daub, floors of packed earth, roofs patched with straw and mud. Yet they find more than materials. They find intention. A chicken bone under a sill, a fragment of woven charm buried in the doorway. Signs that these homes were never built with mere practicality in mind, but with spirit, care, and continuity. The people of the Middle Ages didn't think of themselves as poor or primitive. They thought of themselves as connected to their ancestors, to the land, and to their homes. A cottage wasn't a structure to escape the rain. It was a living testament to human endurance, a place where the sacred met the mundane. Every wall told a story. Every hearth remembered a prayer. And though centuries have silenced their songs and scattered their ashes, the legacy of their craft endures in a deeper way. In every home where laughter fills the air, in every candle lit against the dark, the same spirit stirs. The belief that shelter is more than protection. It is belonging. The medieval peasant, kneeling before his half-built hearth to whisper blessings into the smoke, could never have imagined the modern world. Yet if he could see it, he might smile quietly. For even now we still light fires, hang charms, bless new homes, and hope the walls will keep us safe. The rituals remain. The words have changed. And the spirit, patient, humble, eternal, still dwells wherever we dare to call a house home.